So what is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? It was created in 1988 as a sub-organization of the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations. Its task was to provide the world with a clear scientific view of the current state of knowledge in climate change and its potential environmental and socioeconomic impacts. The last one will be of specific relevance to us. It currently has 195 members, and all members of the two originating organizations are eligible to be able to join. So it's basically a way of gathering and synthesizing the current state of knowledge about climate change and its impacts in order to help provide guidance for policymaking as well as just general understanding. Its research approach should be something that you are familiar with and that the Gleditsch and Nordis article goes into more detail. But specifically, it summarizes the literature and it evaluates its own reports through a review process that isn't blind. The reviewers know who's writing the articles, and it's not blind as to what scholars are recruited to actually join the process. Gleditsch and Nordis, again, talk about the strengths and weaknesses of that approach. I think you can ask some natural questions about what biases this might introduce. In the traditional scientific peer review process, it is double blind, in which the authors do not know who the reviewers are, and the reviewers don't know who their authors are. Who the authors are, the argument being that this should encourage a focus on the paper and the research itself, the quality of it, and it shouldn't be affected by knowing who generated the research, as well as allowing reviewers to speak honestly about what they thought of the research without having to worry about recriminations by the authors. And having it single blind, you can think that that might be involved, as well as who's selected to serve to actually write these chapters. And I think for me, what's interesting is that how they go about finding these articles in order to synthesize should be similar to what you did when you were writing your literature review. I included a paragraph here from the chapter that we focused on, and it basically used search terms of scientific databases. Google Scholar, I guess, would qualify as that. Web of Science, there's a number of other ones. Focused on a specific date period between 2000 and 2013. This is for the 2014 report. And it targeted searches according to specific elements that they wanted to focus on. In this specific issue, they're focusing on culture, indigenous peoples, traditional knowledge, migration, conflict, which we're going to look at, and transboundary resources. And then the review was trying to summarize in the tables that we're going to get at in a second about what the strength of the relationships the research finds, as well as how strong the predicted relationships actually are. The chapter that I assigned you to look at for this week was focused more on human security in the 2014 version of the IPCC report, their fifth report. The main conclusion is that climate change has an effect on human security in a couple of different ways. First, by undermining livelihoods, the simple scarcity argument that we've seen already so far in this class. Makes it harder for people to be able to earn a living and to survive. It compromises culture and identity through moving to industrial centers, to other countries. It might take people away from traditional ways of living, as we'll see in the Arctic in a documentary later on. It increases the likelihood of migration, which we've already touched on, either to other countries or within countries. It also limits the state's capacity to respond to a citizen's needs, because it can limit the revenue that states have to be able to provide, as well as understanding where the challenges actually are. The chapter itself summarizes these results in a couple of tables, focusing on a couple of these specific elements that I touched on. This is the table focusing on livelihoods, and you can see how they categorize these different impacts: simple scarcity and deprivation of basic needs, erosion of livelihood and human capabilities related to human capital and food security, goes into a lot more detail about this and include links to sources. If you are focusing on any of these specific areas, they've kind of done some of the literature review that you might not have come across specific sources. Cultural issues that I already touched on before, and how it connects to human security and migration. Some of these would have been things we've already touched in this class, looking at specific countries. And I think as an overview of trying to connect the human and security aspects, we've already looked at environmental change and how people have different abilities to be able to respond to it. I found this figure useful in that you have groups that are, it takes a certain amount of assets to be able to leave, which is that line in the middle of the x-axis, the people who don't have enough resources to be able to move or have to either adapt or try to mitigate further issues with erosion, agricultural production, or whatever, and those that do have the ability to move are less vulnerable to these changes because they can go into a new environment that would be better able to suit their needs. Excuse me. A couple of other threats of climate change, according to the IPCC. Values, cultural values, touch on how it might change the culture and people's ability to practice their current culture, but it might also change the values that they've had in being tied to the land. Relatedly, indigenous or other forms of knowledge could be lost. We'll see this in the Arctic, but in a number of different cases. We've touched on the Omo River Valley between Kenya and Ethiopia. But it can be useful to try to adapt to changing situations. Migration and mobility are adaptation strategies, being able to deal with the changes by actually moving to places that are more conducive. And there's research, and the chapter does discuss this, that there are specific gender differences in the effects of migration. Overall, some of these changes can lead to violent conflict, and climate change can affect those drivers of conflict that we've already covered in this class. That's a topic that's already been covered. As a way to kind of make this general discussion a bit more visceral, there's a documentary I would encourage you to take a look at. It's 26 minutes, and it looks at the individual level in sub-Saharan Africa, in which there is a very high level of rain-fed agriculture and a susceptibility and a vulnerability to climate change. And they also talk about the current state of the literature related to this. So I'll insert this video in between the other videos that I'm making. So I'd encourage you to watch it if you are interested.